He found the child where the creek had died. The earth was a pattern of cracks, a testament to a thirsty god. She was a small, folded thing, tucked against the baked mud, as if seeking a final comfort from the land that had abandoned her. The sun beat down, a hammer on the anvil of the silence. Her lips were split, the pale brown of old leather. He saw the slight, almost imperceptible rise and fall of her chest, a flicker in the ash. He knelt, his own thirst a distant, grumbling ghost. His canteen was more than half full, an obscene weight in a world so empty. The slosh of the water was a sound too loud, too alive. He uncorked it. A single drop on his finger, held to her mouth, was a prayer, an act of defiance against the sky. He didn't know he was being watched. He didn't know this small mercy, this quiet whisper of humanity, would call down the thunder of 400 warriors upon his home. He only knew the child was alive, and he was not. Not yet. He had been a shadow for years, a man hollowed out by memory. But as the water touched her lips, he felt the first stirrings of a forgotten pulse inside his own chest. The world, for a moment, held its breath with him. It was an act that would either sign his death warrant or rewrite the story of his life. And in that cracked riverbed, under that merciless sun, he could not have known which. The journey back to his cabin was a pilgrimage measured in shallow breaths. The child was a feather in his arms, impossibly light, a bundle of sun-warmed cotton and dormant life. He walked with a care he hadn't afforded anything in a decade. Each step was deliberate, his worn boots sinking into the dust, leaving a trail from one life to another. His shadow stretched long and distorted behind him, a dark shepherd carrying a lost lamb. The cabin, when it came into view, was not a home. It was a shelter. A collection of logs, hewn by his own hands, chinked with mud and stubbornness against the wind. It stood solitary, a single tooth in the jaw of the vast, empty plains. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of pine, dust, and old smoke. He laid her on his own cot, a rough-hewn bed with a single threadbare blanket. Her stillness was profound. It was the stillness of a stone, not of sleep. He moved about the small space with the quiet economy of a man long accustomed to his own company. He stoked the embers in the stone hearth, coaxing a small flame to life. The fire was his only constant companion, a creature that ate wood and breathed warmth into the oppressive loneliness. He ladled water into a small pot, adding a spoonful of dried herbs and a pinch of salt, a broth, something to soothe the rawness of her throat, to gently reintroduce life to a body that had begun to forget it. He remembered another small form, another fever, a memory walled off with stones of grief, a daughter with hair the color of corn silk, her hand small in his. The memory was a sharp, physical pain, a phantom limb aching in the empty spaces of his heart. He pushed it back down, into the dark cellar of his mind, where such ghosts belonged. He would not let this child become a vessel for his sorrow. She deserved more than to be a reflection of a ghost. He sat on a stool beside the cot, waiting for the broth to warm. He studied her face, the fine arch of her brow, the dark lashes resting on her cheeks. She was of the people, the ones who moved like the seasons across this land, the ones the wind spoke of in hushed tones. Their paths had crossed before, but only at a distance. A flicker of movement on a ridge, a cold camp discovered in a hollow. They were a part of the landscape he tried to ignore, a silent, watchful presence. Now, one of them was in his house, under his roof, her life a fragile thread in his scarred hands. He felt a tremor of fear, not of her, but of what she represented. A bridge to a world he did not understand and had been taught to fear. The broth simmered, its thin steam rising like a spirit in the dim light. He dipped a clean rag into the warm liquid, letting it cool just enough. He brought it to her lips again, squeezing a single savory drop onto her tongue. Her eyes fluttered open. They were not the eyes of a child. They were ancient, dark pools, holding the reflection of a hard sky. There was no fear in them, only a deep, unsettling stillness. She did not look at him, but through him, as if he were merely a feature of the landscape, a weathered rock or a gnarled tree. Then her gaze fell upon the small leather pouch tied around her neck. Her fingers, weak as a bird's wing, moved to touch it. A single, small hawk feather protruded from its opening. It was her anchor in a world that had tried to sweep her away. He watched her, this small, fierce creature, and understood. He was not her savior. He was just a temporary shore in a vast, merciless ocean. As dusk bled across the plains, painting the sky in bruised purples and reds, the child took more of the broth. He fed her with the patience of a man who had nothing but time. Each spoonful was a silent conversation. He did not speak, and neither did she. Words felt clumsy, intrusive. The language they shared was one of gesture and need. The crackle of the fire, the scrape of the spoon against the tin bowl, the soft sound of her swallowing. These were their words. These were enough. When she finally fell into a true sleep, her breathing deep and even, he felt a tension release from his own shoulders he hadn't realized he was carrying. He took the blanket from his own bedroll and laid it over her, tucking it gently around her small form. For himself, he would take the floor by the fire. He was used to hardship. The floorboards were a familiar comfort. He sat with his back against the rough-hewn wall, watching the flames dance and weave. The firelight threw long, flickering shadows that turned the small cabin into a place of myth. His rifle leaned against the wall near the door, cold and silent. He thought of picking it up, of keeping watch, but the thought felt wrong. A violation of the fragile peace that had settled in the room. The threat was not from her. The threat, he knew, was from the world outside. The world that had left her to die. The world that had made him who he was. He thought about her people. Would they be searching? Were they grieving? Or had they, like the land itself, moved on, accepting the loss as a part of a brutal cycle? He traced the grain of the wooden floor with his finger. He had built this cabin with his own hands, thinking it a fortress against the world. He had wanted nothing more than to be left alone, to let his own story fade into the dust like an old trail. But the world had a way of finding you. It had sent him this child, this small, silent messenger. She was a question he didn't know how to answer. Her presence filled the cabin, pushing out the ghost that had kept him company for so long. Or perhaps she was a different kind of ghost, one that demanded not remembrance, but action. He closed his eyes, but sleep did not come. Instead, his mind drifted back. Not to the war, not to the loss of his family, but to his own childhood. A memory of his mother, her hands covered in flour, her voice a soft hum as she worked. A memory of safety, of a world that made sense. He had not thought of her in years. The memory was a small, warm coal in the cold hearth of his chest. He opened his eyes. The child stirred in her sleep, a soft murmur escaping her lips. It was not a word, but a sound of comfort. He felt an unfamiliar ache in his throat. It was the feeling of a wall, built brick by painful brick over years, beginning to crumble. He was Silas, a man of the plains, a man who had forgotten how to feel. And in the quiet of his fortress, with a stranger's child sleeping in his bed, he was beginning to remember. The night deepened. The fire burned low, its embers glowing like a sleeping heart. Outside, the coyotes sang their lonely, haunting song to the moon. And inside, for the first time in a long time, Silas did not feel entirely alone. The dawn broke, not with a gentle promise, but with a stark, bloody light. The horizon was a fresh wound, spilling crimson and orange across the gray plains. The air was unnaturally still, holding its breath. Even the prairie grass, usually in constant whispering motion, stood rigid and silent. Silas was already awake. He had not slept. He had watched the fire die and the stars wheel across the sliver of sky visible through his single window. He rose from the floor, his joints protesting with a dull ache. He moved to the cot. The child was still asleep, her face peaceful in the dim light. The leather pouch with its single feather rested on her chest, rising and falling with each steady breath. He felt a fierce, protective instinct that startled him with its intensity. He was a stone that had been still for so long, he'd forgotten he could be moved. He added a few small logs to the glowing embers in the hearth, his movements slow and methodical. The morning ritual, the small acts that gave shape to the empty days. But today was different. The silence outside was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a held blade. He poured water into the basin, splashed his face. The cold shock was a welcome distraction. He looked at his reflection in the small, cracked piece of mirror he'd nailed to the wall. The face that looked back was a stranger's, a map of hardship etched in lines around the eyes and mouth. He saw the gray in his beard, the hollowness in his cheeks. But today, for the first time, he saw something else in his eyes. Not just weariness, a flicker of purpose, a glint of something that might have once been called life. He pulled on his boots, the leather soft and worn. He didn't reach for his rifle. The thought occurred to him, a conditioned reflex from years of solitude and caution, but he dismissed it. Whatever was coming, a rifle would not change its course. It would only escalate it. It would be a loud, foolish shout in a conversation that demanded a whisper. He opened the cabin door, and the world stopped. They were there. A line of them, stretching from the edge of the cottonwoods to the rise of the small hill to the west. A silent, unmoving testament. Not 40, not 100, hundreds. At least 400 warriors, mounted on their war ponies, which stood as still as their riders. They were a living wall, blocking out the horizon. The morning sun glinted off the tips of lances, the beadwork on their chests, the dark, watchful eyes. They were not painted for war. There were no shouts, no aggressive postures. There was only a profound, terrifying stillness, a stillness that was more menacing than any war cry. It was the stillness of judgment. The collective weight of their presence pressed down on him, a physical force that made the air thick and hard to breathe. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drum against the silent symphony of their arrival. This was it, the end of the trail. For a single act of mercy, he had brought an army to his door. He thought of the child sleeping inside. He thought of her feather. He thought of the water. He took a single step out onto the porch, letting the cabin door swing shut behind him. He stood before them, one man against a forest of lances. He was an island in a vast, silent sea. He did not raise his hands. He did not shout. He simply stood and waited. The story of his life had been a quiet, lonely affair. He supposed it was fitting that the final chapter would be witnessed by so many. He stood on the porch, a lone figure, against the backdrop of his small, defiant life. The sun climbed higher, warming the wood beneath his bare feet. He could feel the individual gaze of every man before him. He could feel their history, their anger, their sorrow, their strength. It was a palpable thing, an energy that hummed in the still air. He did not know how long he stood there. Time had become fluid, stretching and compressing. A minute felt like an hour. An hour felt like a single, drawn-out breath. His fear, which had been a wild, frantic bird in his chest, settled into a heavy, cold stone. It was the resignation of a man who has made his peace with the inevitable. He had lived a hard life. He would die a hard death, but he had given the child water. That single, simple act felt like the only thing that mattered now. It was a period at the end of a long, rambling sentence. He thought of the broth, the blanket, the look in her ancient eyes. He had not done it for reward. He had not done it for salvation. He had done it because she was thirsty. It was as simple and as complicated as that. He had expected them to charge, to let out a cry that would tear the sky and ride him down. But they remained still, a gallery of silent judges. Then, from the center of the long line, one rider began to move forward. He rode not with aggression, but with a slow, deliberate grace. The horse, a magnificent paint with a wild mane, seemed to glide over the dry earth. The man on its back was tall and broad-shouldered. His face was a mask of stoicism, carved from the same rock as the mountains on the horizon. His hair was long, threaded with silver, and on his chest he wore a breastplate of polished bone beads that shone in the morning light. He carried no rifle, only a single eagle-feathered lance held upright. He stopped his horse a dozen yards from the porch. The silence that followed was even more profound than before. It was a focused silence, all the energy of the 400 warriors now channeled through this one man. The man's eyes met Silas's. They were dark, intelligent, and held no malice. They held a question. Silas met his gaze. He did not look away. He had nothing left to hide. He had lived his life behind walls. But now, at the end, he would be seen. He thought again of the child inside, safe and sleeping. That was his only defense, his only truth. He inclined his head, a small, almost imperceptible nod. Not of submission. Of acknowledgement. You are here. I am here. Let it be done. The leader's eyes flickered for a moment toward the cabin door, then back to Silas. He spoke, a single word, in his own tongue. A word that Silas did not understand, but whose meaning was as clear as the sharp light of the sun. It was a question. It was the only question that mattered. Silas knew what he was asking. He cleared his throat, his own voice, a rough, unused thing. "She is safe," he said. The words were small in the vast emptiness, but they seemed to echo. "She is warm. She has water." The leader, the man with eyes like chips of obsidian, listened to Silas's words. He showed no reaction, his face an unreadable landscape. He sat upon his horse, a monument of a man, the collective stillness of his warriors flowing into him. Silas stood his ground, his hands loose at his sides. He had offered his truth. There was nothing more to say. The leader spoke again, this time in the broken English of the trade routes, his voice a low rumble, like distant thunder. "The girl," he said. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, a claiming. "The storm took her from us, the land." Silas nodded slowly. He understood. A sudden squall, a disoriented horse, a child separated from the band. The plains were unforgiving. They gave life, and they took it away without ceremony. "I found her by the dry creek," Silas said, his voice quiet. "She was thirsty." The leader's gaze did not waver. "You gave water." Again, a statement, not an accusation, not a query, a fact. They had seen. Of course they had seen. They were always watching. They were the eyes of the hills, the ears of the wind. The thought that his most private act of mercy had been witnessed was unsettling, yet strangely calming. There were no secrets in this land. He had nothing to defend, nothing to explain. The act spoke for itself. The leader, who Silas would come to know as Stone Eagle, dismounted. He moved with a fluid power, his moccasins making no sound on the hard-packed earth. He handed the reins of his horse to the warrior beside him and walked toward the cabin. He did not look at Silas. His focus was entirely on the door. Silas did not move. He did not block the way. To do so would be an act of fear, of mistrust. He had chosen his path when he knelt in the dust of the creek bed. He would see it through to its end. Stone Eagle placed his hand on the rough wood of the door. He paused. His head bowed for a moment, as if listening. Then he pushed it open and stepped inside. Silas remained on the porch, his back to the open door. He could hear the faint murmur of the man's voice from within, a soft, guttural sound like a prayer or a lullaby. He could hear a small, sleepy reply. The sound of the child's voice, the first he had heard. It was clear and high like a bird's call. He closed his eyes. The tension in the air outside seemed to shift. The 400 warriors were still silent, but their stillness was different now. It was not the stillness of a predator. It was the stillness of a vigil. They were waiting for their chief. They were waiting for the child. Silas heard footsteps behind him. He turned. Stone Eagle stood in the doorway, and in his arms he held the girl. She was awake, her dark eyes clear. Her arms were wrapped around the man's neck, her face buried in the crook of his shoulder. She held on to him with a desperate, trusting strength. She was home. Stone Eagle looked at Silas, and for the first time, the hardness in his eyes softened. It was not a smile. It was something deeper. A look of profound, weary gratitude. A look that acknowledged the chasm between their two worlds, and the fragile bridge that had just been built across it. "She is my daughter," Stone Eagle said. His voice was thick with an emotion he did not try to hide. "We searched. The sun was our enemy. We believed the spirits had taken her." He looked from Silas to the vast, empty land around them, and then back. "You," he said, the single word carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken thoughts. "You gave her water." The moment hung in the air, fragile and sacred. The great chief, Stone Eagle, stood with his daughter in his arms, her small form a testament to both the cruelty and the kindness of the world. Silas looked at the girl, this child he had known for less than a day, and felt a pang of loss so sharp it stole his breath. He had not realized how much her small presence had filled the echoing emptiness of his life. But this was not his child. This was not his story. He was merely a chapter in hers. He gave a single, slow nod. "A man gives water to the thirsty," he said, the words feeling like a creed he hadn't known he possessed. It was the law of the desert, the law of humanity, a law that transcended language and tribe. Stone Eagle held his gaze, a silent communication passing between them, an understanding, a respect born not of words, but of a shared experience of the harshness of this land. The warriors, who had been a terrifying wall of potential violence, now seemed transformed. They were fathers, brothers, sons. Silas could see it in the subtle softening of their postures, the relief that washed over their stoic faces like a gentle rain. They were not an army. They were a family that had found its lost child. Stone Eagle turned and walked back toward his horse, his daughter still clinging to him. He murmured to her in their language, his voice a soothing balm. As he reached his horse, he stopped and turned back one last time. He looked at Silas. Then he looked at the cabin, a simple structure of wood and mud, a poor man's fortress. He looked at the thin curl of smoke rising from the stone chimney. Then he spoke to one of his men. a quick series of commands. The warrior nodded and rode back into the line. For a moment, Silas wondered if this was it, if they would simply leave the event a strange fever dream on the plains. But they did not leave. They waited. Stone Eagle did not mount his horse. He stood, holding his daughter, watching Silas with those same unreadable eyes. Soon, several warriors dismounted. They came forward, not with weapons, but with gifts. They laid them on the porch, one by one, without a word. A thick buffalo robe, richly painted with symbols Silas did not understand. A side of smoked venison, wrapped in clean hides. A leather pouch filled with tobacco and herbs. Another left a finely woven blanket, its colors as vibrant as the sunset. The offerings piled up, a silent testament of gratitude. It was more wealth than Silas had seen in years. But it was not the value of the items that struck him. It was the gesture. It was honor. It was a language he understood more deeply than words. Finally, Stone Eagle himself stepped forward again. He reached into a pouch at his own belt and pulled out an object. He held it out to Silas in the palm of his hand. It was not a weapon. It was not a trinket. It was a single, perfect eagle feather, identical to the one in his daughter's lance, tied with a strip of blue-dyed leather. A symbol of courage, of honor, of the Great Spirit. Silas looked at the feather, then at Stone Eagle. He slowly reached out his own hand, his scarred, calloused fingers brushing against the chief's. He took the feather. It was light as air, but it felt as heavy as a life. "This," Stone Eagle said, his voice low and solemn, "is for the man who gives water." He then looked at his daughter, who peeked over his shoulder at Silas. She was not afraid. She reached out a small hand, and in it was her own pouch. She opened her small fingers to reveal the hawk feather Silas had first seen. She held it out to him, a child's gift, an exchange. Silas took the small feather and held it alongside the great one, the eagle and the hawk, the chief and the child. He looked at the two feathers in his palm, a silent promise between two worlds. The departure was as quiet and sudden as their arrival. Stone Eagle mounted his painted horse. His daughter settled securely in front of him. He gave Silas one last look, a look that conveyed more than a lifetime of words. It was a look of debt, of respect, of a bond forged in dust and mercy. He raised his lance in a slow, deliberate salute. Then he turned his horse, and without a backward glance, began to ride away. The 400 warriors turned as one, a silent, fluid movement. The forest of lances became a receding tide. They did not rush. They moved with the steady, unhurried pace of the seasons, melting back into the landscape from which they had emerged. There was no sound but the soft thud of countless hooves on the dry earth, a sound like a distant, fading heartbeat. Silas stood on his porch, the gifts of a nation at his feet, the two feathers clutched in his hand. He watched until they were just a dark line on the horizon, and then nothing at all. The silence that returned was different. It was not the oppressive, watchful silence of the morning. It was not the empty, lonely silence he had lived with for years. It was a new kind of silence, a peaceful silence, a silence full of meaning. The air felt lighter. The sun on his face felt like a benediction, not a curse. He looked down at the pile of offerings. The buffalo robe, the blanket, the food. These were things that would ensure his survival through the coming winter. But they were more than that. They were proof that he was not alone in the world. Proof that a single act of kindness could ripple outward, changing the shape of the world in ways he could never have imagined. He walked back inside the cabin. The space felt immense, empty. The cot where the child had slept was a stark reminder of her absence. The air no longer held the faint scent of her presence. The ghosts were gone, but a new, more potent emptiness had taken their place. It was the ache of connection, followed by departure. He had opened a door in his heart he had long believed to be sealed shut, and now he felt the draft. He ran his thumb over the soft down of the hawk feather, a child's treasure. He looked at the eagle feather, a chief's honor. He had been given a gift far greater than the robes and the food. He had been given a story. He had been given a reason. He had been a man adrift, and they had shown him ashore. For years, he had seen the plains as an enemy, a vast, indifferent expanse he had to fight against every day just to exist. Now, he saw it differently. He saw it as a place of terrible beauty, a place of harsh lessons and profound grace, a place where a man could lose everything and then, in the most unexpected way, find a piece of himself he thought was gone forever. He went to the small, uneven shelf where he kept his few meaningful possessions. A tarnished silver locket that belonged to his wife, a child's worn wooden toy, a handful of spent cartridges from a battle long ago. He cleared a space among these relics of his past. He carefully laid the two feathers there. They did not belong with the symbols of his grief. They were symbols of his rebirth. The sun streamed through the open doorway, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air like tiny golden spirits. Silas stood in the shaft of light, and for the first time since he had built this cabin, he felt like he was truly home. The days that followed were quiet, but their texture had changed. The rhythm of Silas's life remained the same, chopping wood, mending fences, tending to his horse, but the internal silence was different. It was no longer a void. It was a space for reflection. The memory of the child's face, of the line of warriors against the dawn sky, was a constant, living presence. It was not a haunting, but a companionship. He used the gifts they had left. He ate the smoked venison, its rich flavor a welcome change from the salted pork and beans that had been his staple. At night, as the autumn chill began to creep in, he wrapped himself in the painted buffalo robe. It was heavy and warm, and as he drifted to sleep, he imagined he could feel the strength of the animal, the history of the symbols painted on its hide. He was no longer just surviving. He was living. He found himself noticing things he had long ignored, the way the light changed on the distant mesas throughout the day, the intricate patterns of a spider's web beaded with morning dew, the particular song of a meadowlark perched on a fence post. The world had not changed, but he had. His senses were sharper, as if the encounter had scraped away a layer of calloused indifference from his soul. One afternoon, while checking a trap line near the dry creek bed where he had found her, he saw a hawk circling high overhead. It rode the thermals with an effortless grace, a dark speck against the vast blue canvas of the sky. He stopped and watched it, shielding his eyes with his hand. He thought of the small feather in his cabin. He thought of the child. He wondered where she was, if she was safe, if she ever thought of the strange, quiet man who had given her water. He felt a connection to that distant bird, a kinship. He was a part of this land, not just a trespasser upon it. The land was no longer his enemy. It was his witness. He began to talk to his horse more, not just giving commands, but sharing his thoughts, his voice a low murmur in the quiet of the stable. The horse, a sturdy gelding named Dust, would flick its ears and watch him with its large, placid eyes, a patient and unjudging confidant. She was so small, Dust, he might say, polishing a piece of tack. Barely a thing at all. But she had the eyes of a general. He worked with a renewed purpose. He repaired the roof of his cabin, not just to keep out the rain, but because it was a home worth keeping. He cleared a small patch of land for a garden, turning over the soil, preparing it for the spring. He was planting for a future he now believed he would be a part of, The loneliness was still there, a familiar ache in his bones, but it was no longer a bitter, all-consuming force. It was just a part of him, like the scars on his hands or the gray in his beard. It was a quiet reminder of what he had lost, but also of what he had found. The two feathers on his shelf became his compass. When the familiar despair threatened to creep back in, he would look at them. The eagle feather for honor, the hawk feather for hope. They were a promise, a covenant. He was the man who gives water. That was his identity now. It was a title more meaningful than any he had ever held. It was a purpose. And in the vast, silent heart of the plains, a man with a purpose could never be truly alone. Winter arrived, blanketing the plains in a thick shroud of white. The snow muffled the world, creating a profound and holy silence. Silas was prepared. His small cabin was fortified, his larder stocked with the venison from Stone Eagle's people and the preserves he'd had the foresight to make. The buffalo robe became his constant companion against the biting cold. In the long, dark evenings, he sat by the fire, the flames casting a warm orange glow on the log walls. He would hold the two feathers in his hand, their lightness a stark contrast to the heavy weight of the winter pressing in from outside. He did not feel trapped. He felt sheltered. The solitude of winter was no longer a punishment. It was a sanctuary. He thought of the people, of Stone Eagle and his daughter. He wondered how they fared in the deep snow. He imagined them in their winter lodges, safe and warm, surrounded by family, their own fires burning bright. The thought did not make him feel more alone. It made him feel connected, a part of a larger, unseen community bound by the shared challenge of the season. He was no longer just Silas, the recluse. He was Silas, the neighbor to a nation he could not see. One blizzard raged for 3 days, the wind howling like a pack of wolves, piling snow into massive drifts that buried his windows. He was sealed inside his small world. In years past, such a storm would have fed his despair, confirming his isolation. Now it was different. He spent the time methodically cleaning his rifle, carving a new handle for his axe, rereading the few worn books he owned. But mostly, he sat and thought. He revisited every moment of the encounter. The sight of the child in the dust, the feel of her light weight in his arms, the terrifying, beautiful sight of the warriors at dawn, the look in Stone Eagle's eyes, the exchange of the feathers. These memories were his sustenance. They were more nourishing than the food in his larder, more warming than the fire in his hearth. When the storm finally broke, the world outside was transformed. It was a pristine, dazzling landscape of white and blue. The air so cold and clean it stung his lungs. He dug his way out of the cabin, the work hard but satisfying. As he cleared a path to the stable, he saw tracks in the snow. Not deer, not coyote. A single set of prints, made by a rider on an unshod horse. They led from the direction of the distant hills, came to within 100 yards of his cabin, paused, and then turned back. There was a single dark object half buried in the snow where the rider had stopped. Silas walked over, his heart beating a little faster. It was a small, tightly wrapped bundle of hide. He carried it back to the cabin. Inside, by the fire, he carefully unwrapped it. It was a pouch of dried berries, sweet and potent, and 2 smoked fish. A gift left in the dead of winter. A silent message. We have not forgotten. You are not alone. He looked out the window at the single track leading away into the white wilderness. A profound sense of peace settled over him. A bond had been forged that day by the dry creek. A bond that the miles and the snows could not break. He was the man who gives water. And even in the deepest, coldest winter, water finds a way to flow. Spring came, as it always does, with a slow, reluctant melt. The plains reemerged, sodden and brown, then slowly, miraculously, blushed green. The air filled with the scent of damp earth and new life. The meadowlarks returned to the fence posts, their songs a celebration of renewal. Silas felt the change in his own spirit. He was emerging from a long winter of the soul. He worked the small plot of land he had cleared, his hands sinking into the cool, rich soil. He planted seeds, corn, beans, squash. The work was grounding, hopeful. It was an act of faith in the future. He was no longer simply enduring the seasons. He was participating in them. One clear afternoon, as he was repairing a section of fence line that had been damaged by the heavy snows, he saw them. A small party of riders on the horizon. Not an army this time, 5 or 6 of them. His heart did not pound with fear. Instead, a sense of calm recognition washed over him. He did not run for his rifle. He laid down his tools and waited. They rode directly toward him, their pace unhurried. As they drew closer, he recognized the leader. It was not Stone Eagle, but a younger man he had seen at the chief's side. They stopped a respectful distance away. The leader raised a hand in greeting. Silas raised his in return. "The man who gives water," the warrior said, his English clear. "Stone Eagle sends his greetings. He asks if your winter was kind." "It was," Silas replied, his voice steady. "Your chief's gifts kept the cold at bay." The warrior nodded, a flicker of a smile on his face. "Our winters are always hard. It is good to have a friend on the other side of the wind." A friend. The word resonated deep inside Silas. "How is the girl?" he asked, the question he had been holding all winter. "Little Sparrow," the warrior said, using her name. "She is strong. She tells the story of the thirsty time. She tells of the quiet man who brought the rain." He pointed to a small bundle tied to one of the horses. "She sends a gift." One of the other men brought it forward. It was a pair of moccasins, beautifully beaded with a hawk motif, childlike in their stitching, but made with care. A gift from Little Sparrow herself. Silas took them, his rough fingers tracing the intricate beadwork. He felt a lump form in his throat. "Tell her," he said, his voice thick, "that the quiet man is grateful." The warrior nodded. "We go now to hunt. We will see you when the grass is high." They turned and rode off, leaving Silas standing alone in the vast green expanse, a pair of a child's moccasins in his hands. He looked down at them, then up at the wide, open sky. He was no longer a shadow on this land. He was a part of its story. A man who had found his purpose not in taking, but in giving. A man who had learned that the most powerful thing in a world of hardship was not a weapon or a fortress, but a single drop of water given freely. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he would never be truly alone again. Kindness is a language the deaf can hear and the blind can see. It is a currency that transcends borders, a truth that disarms armies. We often believe that courage is found in the grand gesture, in the heat of battle or the roar of defiance. But sometimes the most profound courage is quiet. It is the choice to kneel when the world expects you to stand tall, to offer a hand when convention demands a fist. It is the simple human act of seeing another's thirst and sharing your water without expectation of reward or fear of consequence. Silas was a man hollowed out by his past, living in a world that encouraged walls and weapons. Yet his truest moment, the act that redefined his existence, was one of quiet, unassuming mercy. He did not know it would bring 400 warriors to his door. He did not know it would forge a bond of friendship and respect. He only knew that a child was thirsty. In our own lives, we are surrounded by dry creek beds, by moments of quiet desperation in others. We may not face down armies, but we face our own tests of character every day. The story of the man who gives water is a reminder that no act of kindness, however small, is ever wasted. It is a seed that can grow in the most barren soil, a single drop that can ripple outward, touching shores we never thought possible, and in doing so, quenching a thirst we never knew we had.